Decarbonizing Buildings in Ontario, a series for SCAN members across Canada. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that this section is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards. Don Booth will give today's land acknowledgement.
This seminar is hosted in Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. These lands are covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our topic today raises the underlying question, what do people need? An Indigenous perspective comes from Dr. Cindy Blackstock. The model of needs is in the formation of a teepee. At the base is self-actualization, the whole spectrum of an individual's needs, including those necessary for our personal survival, followed by community actualization at the top, and at the top is cultural perpetuity or breath of life belief. Dr. Blackstock describes cultural perpetuity this way. We have been given the ancestors' teachings and the feelings and the spirit. We can do a couple of things with that. We can say that what we know is adequate and we're not indie enough and we don't know enough about it or we don't want to pass it on and we hold our breath and our people stop. Or we can nourish that breath. We can breathe in even deeper knowledge of others and understand it at a deep level and then breathe it forward. That is the breath of life.
Don? In our first session, we learned about air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and district energy systems. And we're introduced to the concept of embodied carbon. In today's session, we zoom out from the nuts and bolts of heat pumps, district energy pipes, wood, concrete, and steel, to the broader question of how do we get to a decarbonized building sector in a way that does not break the bank or the electrical system and is affordable for all. There will be a Q&A after each speaker. We will be using Zoom's chat session this time. We encourage people with questions during the presentation to leave them in the chat for our chat moderator. We begin with former councillor and CEO of Toronto District Heating Corp, now Enwave, Richard Gilbert, who will present on long-term heating plans and more generally on decarbonizing the existing building sector, followed by Professor Shoshanna Saxe, who will give us some ideas for strategies about reducing embodied carbon. Our first speaker, Richard Gilbert, was the first CEO of Toronto District Heating Corporation, as I mentioned, and the city councillor. He's had a long and varied career with a repeating emphasis on municipal issues and with a scientific dimension, if you don't mind me saying. He is currently chair of the Boltzmann Institute, which you'll be hearing more about. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you. So we need the slides, perhaps, and couldn't begin. I'm very pleased to be here for this group, and talking about this topic. We can move straight into the next slide. That's just the start, and we've already heard something about this slide about me. One thing that wasn't mentioned was that when I retired from council in 1991, that was 34 years ago, I became the first president of the Canadian Urban Institute. And during my rather short tenure, we did a lot of work on deep lake water cooling, the idea, working with the guy who, Bob Tamblyn, who thought the whole thing up, working with public and private sector possibilities, working with Metro from a city perspective. I had been on both Metro Council and City of Toronto Council, and just basically uh, moving to get it going, but not doing the critical thing that made deep lake water cooling possible, which was to combine it with the city's fresh water intake. But I think you heard something about that from the wonderful presentation you had by David McMillan. Next slide, please. The Boltzmann Institute. So that's our mission at the top in red. We were founded in 2022, mainly so that we could apply for some money. And we were successful in our first go. Could we just go back to the previous slide? We were successful in our first go, got $750,000 to do our two pathways project. We've completed the project, but we're writing it up just now. But basically, it's looking at two routes for Ontario. One, 100% electrification, and the other is 70% district energy, 30% electrification, roughly. I'm going to come back to that. Next slide, please. One of the first things we did, apart from the project that I just mentioned, is organize a study tour in May and June last year. We went to 12 facilities in Northern Europe, a variety of sizes, ranging from cities of a couple of million down to communities of less than 20,000. All of which were firmly moving towards decarbonization. All of which, as does the rest of Europe, have a strong focus on serving existing buildings because they're not building very much in Europe. They are expecting essentially zero population growth between now and 2050. We are expecting 40% in Ontario. It's an absolutely huge difference. So we're expecting that about 30% of the building stock that's going to be available in 2050 has not yet been built. But they're expecting that only about 2%, which is just, a little ordinary turnover without accommodating population, maybe a little more than 2% because they're like us, their household size is falling. So we went to Northern Europe because they were all on the path for decarbonization, because there was a lot of district energy experience in there, because they were doing the hard stuff, which is serving existing buildings. Next slide, please. So we want this one, yes. So we had a lot of conclusions from that study tour, and if you go on our website, you can see it at the bottom right there on all the slides. You can get a report on the study tour, but there were two general conclusions that we made. The first one we didn't expect, and that is that the optimism about decarbonization possibilities for buildings was there and evident, and some communities, big ones and small ones, were almost at decarbonization. Copenhagen reckons it's about 96% there. One smaller community on Gotland Island reckons it was already there. Everybody we spoke to said, yes, we're going to decarbonize our buildings. By that, I mean decarbonize the building operation, particularly space heating. We talked to a lot of people about more general climate issues and decarbonization, and there was actually more pessimism than optimism that any of the other sectors would be decarbonized by 2050 or 2045, as some people's targets were. Transportation, maybe in Norway they thought it was possible, but even then not necessarily for aviation and heavy trucking. Elsewhere, maybe not even for ordinary passenger travel. Uh, Agriculture, not much progress, some progress, but not much, and not a real prospect of decarbonization. Industry varied a lot according to the industry, but overall, not much optimism. Decarbonization of buildings was where we found people really working hard. It's the biggest source in the EU, so that's good. A larger source, a larger share than here. So even here, we should be focusing perhaps more on it because it's something that can be done. The second general conclusion was that you needed a heating plan, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. Next slide, please. You've gone through two, one back. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, 70% of the floor space to be available in Ontario in 2050, approximately, exists today, and 30% is to be constructed. Now, the 30%, at least in theory, needs, and to a considerable extent in practice, needs little or no added energy if it's built right. If you build it to passive house standards, you can get down to almost near zero, and you can build to net zero standards. And if you look at this table, the left-hand number column, the peak watts per meter, that's the amount that you have to put in at the peak. You can see working from the bottom that net zero energy use, you don't have to put any in because they are literally at net zero. And everything that they need is either coming from the building, solar, or is the building doesn't lose that any heat, essentially, or almost none. The passive house standard recognizes up to 10 watts per square meter. If you look in Ontario, which is and the residential after 2015, that's the current range, 65 to 130 watts per square meter. I couldn't get a number for the older residential buildings, but it's going to be much higher. Moving to the next column, that was the peak. And the next column is the annual energy use for heating purposes in kilowatt hours. You can see before 1946, the buildings are up at 219 kilowatt hours per square meter. There's been a remarkable change in Ontario in how buildings are constructed, and current buildings are only using a quarter of that, around 52, but they're still way above, more than 3 times above the passive house standard. And of course, they're above the net zero standard, which would be nothing. You would need to add no heat. Now, the next column shows what it costs to construct according to passive house standard and net zero energy use in Ontario for new buildings. And you can see that in both cases, there's the possibility of it not costing any more than regular construction. The chances are it will cost a little bit more in the case of passive house and rather more in the case of net zero. But both of those can be recovered from either the lack of energy use or the much lower energy use. And in none of the calculations that have been done, is there a payback period of more than 15 years on these. It's different if you are trying to fix old buildings so that they can meet passive house standards. And that is the red number in residential after 2015. 10 to 20% of the building value is what it costs. So if you've got a building that costs $1 million or an apartment that costs $1 million, it's going to be between 100 and 200,000. And achieving net zero is going to be much more than that. It could be 400,000 on that $1 million. It doesn't really pay to achieve gains through insulation at a very deep level. it really does pay to do it for new buildings. And what alarms me a little bit is that almost all of the district energy projects that we have going on in Canada now and in Ontario and the GTHA are on new buildings, which there could be a different approach. It could be, let's make the buildings so they don't need energy or much energy, and maybe not think too much about district energy there. And let's focus district energy on where it's truly useful, which is the 70%, not the 30%. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. So this is the largest passive house it's spelt in the German there, the largest passive house development in the world, as far as I know. It's in Heidelberg in Germany. It's not right down to zero, so it's got supplemental heating from a wood chip fueled combined heat and power plant. The current cost premium over regular construction is between 5 and 8%. It was at the beginning of the construction of this development. Can we just go back to, was at the beginning of the construction of the, was at the beginning of the construction of the development considerably higher. As they learned and as they developed economies of scale, the cost of the passive, meeting the passive house standard came right down. And it may well fall down to zero in the next few years. I think they're about 80% through the project development now. So far, the space heating energy use is 63% lower than that for comparable buildings in Heidelberg. And Heidelberg happens to have a rather interesting mix of old buildings and buildings that are built to a fairly high energy conservation standard anyway, not yet passive house, but quite good. Next slide, please. So one of those conclusions from the study tour was that you need to do really good planning. And so we did a conference at the University of Toronto on this in March, and some of you were there. And we asked the question, should Ontario municipalities be required to engage in heating planning? And we use the term heating planning rather than heat planning, because if you go on the web, heat planning is confusing, confuses people with planning for hot days. And we're dealing here with heating, which in Ontario is the cause of about 15 times as much in the way of emissions as cooling. That's going to go down, but it's probably not going to go down much below about 10 times, even by 2050. One of the conference participants proposed a better term than heating planning, which is thermal energy planning. And I think we're going to prefer to use that. It covers both heating and cooling. It's more accurate. It never will be confused with planning for hot weather. And the working definition for the conference was borrowed from somewhere, and I can't remember where. But what it does is estimate the energy use for space heating and cooling and domestic hot water by all the buildings in a neighborhood or district, both current ones and the ones that are expected. That's stage one. Stage two is to identify all possible sources of usable non-carbon and otherwise wasted thermal energy. And phase three is to match that up into a plan with a target, usually net zero in 2050. In Germany, it's net zero in 2045. If the city of Toronto does one, it'll have to be net zero in 2040, because that's their, I think, impossible target, but that's their target now. And the plan includes 5-year updates. Several municipalities in Ontario have done a community energy plan, which is a good step towards the thermal energy plan. A community energy plan basically focuses on energy sources, typically. and it doesn't go into the kind of detail that a thermal energy plan, as I've defined it, would. It doesn't look at every building. Obviously, thermal energy planners cannot look at every building, but they can use techniques to get a good estimate of what each building is needing in the way of heating and cooling, and they make use of that. If you go on our website and look under events, you will see two of our presenters at that March 20 conference were from Germany. They're specialists in what they call heat planning, and they have between them 48 really excellent slides, which tells you just about everything you could possibly want to know about this topic. Next slide, please. So we did a little survey after, and a lot of people sent in emails, and there were two things that were agreed at the conference. One, and from what was said at the conference, thermal energy planning is an essential prerequisite for the attainment of net zero greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. That was the first and most important one. And the second one, which there was much agreement about, was that such planning would best be done by municipalities. The area where there was less agreement was who should fund this. We had an estimate at the meeting from our German friends, and we have numbers from elsewhere, that it's very, very roughly $2 per inhabitant per year to do the energy planning, thermal energy planning. The typical plan takes a year to 2 years to do. It depends on the resources you throw at it. It has to be renewed every 5 years. So if you average all of that out, you're into, in today's dollars, about $2 a person. It can vary a lot. It's more for smaller municipalities per capita. It's more for municipalities such as Toronto and Mississauga that have a lot of commercial space in them per resident. Next slide, please. We had an intervention, a presentation at the meeting by somebody from IESO, the electricity system operator responsible for planning electricity in Ontario. And he pointed out, Tom Agard, that the current planning outlook by this provincial government agency is for less than 10% of Ontario to have heat pumps, households to have heat pumps by 2050. No indication of what the other 90% is going to have, except that he said that probably they're going to choose natural gas unless there's a change in provincial policy. Actually, at the moment, it's about 70% fueled by natural gas, about 15% fueled by electricity, and the others have wood and propane and a mixture. The Ontario government does have a policy about reducing emissions, but only until 2030. It reconfirmed that policy in 2022. It originally was said, I think, in 2018 when soon after they came in. The interesting thing about it is that in 2018 they were 22%. Were at the end of the Liberal and changed to the Tories in 2018. They were 22% below 2005. Their target is 30% by 2030. They'd got to 22% by 2018, and they're still there. The last 7 years, there's been absolutely no progress on reducing emissions. There has been some progress in some areas, but it's been offset by the large amount of natural gas that's being used to generate electricity. Some of it is because of refurbishment of nuclear plants, but not all of it. Next slide. Another presentation at that meeting was a very powerful one by Jim Cotton, who's a prof at McMaster. and head of its Energy Institute there. And he used this slide to show what is the peak and mean power in electricity in Ontario. So in electricity, we have a peak of about 22 gigawatts. That's the rate at which energy is delivered, and an average of about 16. It's usually around 16. Doesn't go much below about 16, but it does on peak times now in the summer in Ontario go up to 22, 23. That's on the left. On the right is looking at heat in Ontario, and most of this is provided by natural gas, but looking at it from a gigawatt point of view, which is not normally done, but is an entirely valid thing to do. What is the peak natural gas service to buildings for heating? And it's nowhere near 22, 23. It's up around 70, 68, 67, something like that gigawatts. And if you are going to convert all of that heating or a large part of that heating to electricity, that electricity may not have to rise all the way up to near 70 because there will be a little bit of economy efficiency there. But I think you all know that heat pumps efficiency goes down to near zero. Efficiency improvement goes down to near zero when temperatures get below about minus 15, minus 20. So that's the measure of what would have to be done in order to electrify heating. That was a strong presentation, and again, that's available on the web. Next slide, please. So if we don't have thermal energy planning, what's going to happen? Well, we'd continue our focus on solutions for individual properties, giving them all gas furnaces or maybe heat pumps, with some district energy for new development, but the big challenge, which is existing buildings, would be mostly ignored. If we continue as we are, we'll just be letting the marketplace sort that out, and it will be a mess, and it won't work. One of the interesting things about where we are now in Ontario is that air source heat pumps are actually producing more emissions from their use of natural gas, from the increase in natural gas generation, than natural gas furnaces in houses. And if you don't believe this, go to our District Energy Digest number 9, which is on our website. Look at page 4, and there's the analysis there showing how, at the moment, air source heat pumps are actually worse for the environment than natural gas furnaces. That will not last if we get rid of natural gas generation of electricity, but while we have it, and the basic thing is that natural gas furnaces are about 85% efficient, and natural gas generation of electricity is only about 45% efficient. And that's where you get all the emissions coming from. The electricity infrastructure we're planning can accommodate some growth in heating electrification without impacting electricity cost very much. I mentioned we have a peak of about 22, 23. We have a capacity of getting up near 40. So there can certainly be, and you need some of that anyway for reserve, but there can be some growth. But probably in the 2030s, if people keep switching to heat pumps, which are going to use a lot of electricity at the peak, we are going to see a big acceleration in upward acceleration in electricity costs. We've been trying to put a number on this. We may have one by the time we get our report done. I'm guessing, but I think we're looking at electricity costs that are going to be in the order of 4 times what we are now paying, which is relatively high. But that's just my it may be lower or even higher than that when we get firmer numbers, and they won't be very firm anyway. Next slide, please. Okay, Ontario municipalities could move now to doing thermal energy plans. There's no legislative reason. I mentioned the cost of it. I've given examples for Toronto. I noticed there's somebody from Kingston here, Karen Stoss. I just chose Kingston as a smaller municipality. It would, for the whole province, for the first decade, it would be about 30 million a year, which sounds a lot, but is peanuts when you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars for electricity generation. And a bigger problem than funding, although funding is always a big problem, could be that we simply don't have the skilled labor available to do that degree of work on planning. It doesn't. It's nowhere near as complicated as putting in electricity infrastructure. The skill level is considerably less, and yet you certainly need some training, and we're not getting much out of our community colleges and universities at the moment towards that end. Give you an example. If you look at the University of Toronto, unless I've missed it, there is absolutely nothing. This is the biggest engineering department in the province, in the country, biggest engineering faculty. There is nothing going on district energy, just nothing at all. Next slide, please. So Ontario municipalities presently have all the power they need, except in one area, to get on with district heating and cooling. Providing they do it the right way, which mostly involves setting up a separate business corporation, such as Markham has done, Markham District Energy, and they conform to a few things and few rules, and worry a little bit about what they are guaranteeing in that business corporation, and so on and so on. I don't want to go into details, but basically they have within limits all the power that they need to move ahead on legal power. They need to move ahead on district energy, with one exception, and that is they do not have the power to require connection. Municipalities in BC, and that's the only province in Canada that do have that power. Again, they have to do it in the right way. It's a dangerous tool to give somebody to require them to buy something, and this is a monopoly, and so on and so on. Interestingly enough, when you look at Europe, some countries give their municipalities that power. Denmark, for example, others don't, Sweden. And yet there's not a big difference between those two countries. Denmark is a little bit ahead of Sweden in district energy, but not that much. But it is certainly good, and probably is more important in Canada, where there is such stiff competition from low-cost natural gas. So I do think that in Ontario, municipalities need the ability to require connection when they have been through a proper planning process and done everything else correctly, and so on, and they're ready to go. So I propose at the bottom that we should allow municipalities with well-fashioned thermal energy plans to require connection in specific parts of their jurisdiction area. Next slide, please. Funding is the other big issue. There's a huge amount of money required. We are working on having an estimate. Our ballpark is that what you need for district energy to serve 70% of the province is roughly half of what you would need to serve 100% of the province with electricity. It would be 80%. Some of it is already served, but so it would be a bit less than 100%. But what we're talking about there are hundreds of billions of dollars. These are extraordinarily large sums of money. IESO has estimated that you need around $400 billion by 2050 to provide for an unspecified amount of heating that is probably short of 100%. They're a bit vague about this, but we don't have firm numbers about this, but we think that sentence at the top captures it with the possibility, quite a strong possibility, that you would have overall cost savings if you went down the district energy route. So it would make sense for the province, which has to backstop all of this, to invest in district energy or to facilitate investment in district energy. But the next point I make here is that maybe municipalities can do it themselves. I happen to have got interested in Bristol, UK, partly because I have a sister who lives there. It's a population about the size of Hamilton. She's not at all interested in any of this stuff. I get it from other people there. But they had a small district energy system. They needed literally billions of dollars in their pounds to use their district energy to move towards net zero. They issued a request for expressions of interest in investing in Bristol. They got 180 responses, 52 from outside the UK. They eventually chose two of them, both out, one from Sweden, one from the US, to sign a 20-year deal where these two investors are putting in all the money. Bristol's not putting any money in. What Bristol is giving is the right to use the street allowance, the cooperation from the city, and all of that stuff, and access to their social housing, which is maybe 15, 20% of the housing stock in the city. So there are things like that that come from Bristol's side, but they've only agreed on the first 5-year tranche, which is very roughly 2 billion Canadian dollars. And this is just for a municipality the size of Hamilton. 60% of that is going on district energy. What this tells me is that the fact that they got 180 expressions of interest in investing this kind of money in Bristol tells me that there's a huge amount of patient money out there that is looking to invest in utilities. And basically, district energy is a utility. Next slide. So the two requirements for that kind of investment are a high quality thermal energy plan, and we've talked about that. The other one, which is relevant to Ontario, is we need, for the municipal scene, a stable legal administrative context. We do not have that in Ontario. We have a provincial government that is in many, many ways simply arbitrarily overruling municipalities, cancelling their projects, doing things like that. That is not something that investors like. They would not like their money to go into a municipality or a municipal corporation, owned corporation, with the province dickering around saying, oh, we want to change the size of the board, or we're doing this. That kind of interference is not something investors like. Next slide. So a thermal energy plan is neutral, as initially at least, as to how these buildings are heated and cooled. But the generally accepted thing is that if you can do district energy, which you can't everywhere because the densities are too low and other reasons, if you can do district energy, that's the way to go. And here are some reasons for that. It could be a lower cost. It means that a corporation is responsible for moving towards net zero, not the individual homeowners' choices as to how they do things. Also, district energy is flexible as to heat sources. That's a hugely important point that requires almost a whole webinar on its own. And another webinar could be on storage, which is something that district energy can do. Storing hot water is less than 1/100th of the cost per energy unit than storing electricity. And that means it's economic to store summer heat and use it in the winter. Enormously powerful thing. So those are reasons why district energy should be looked at before other ways of doing it, but always recognizing that there have to be alternatives. And last slide. Here are my conclusions. Focus in new development on having as little thermal energy use as possible. Focus district energy efforts on existing buildings rather than new buildings. Require Ontario municipalities to produce thermal energy plans, and have the Ontario government support municipalities by empowering connection, facilitating funding, and providing a stable legal administrative context for their activities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. And I'll turn it over to Dawn, who will take care of the question and answer. If you can put them in the chat, or if you want, you can raise your hand.
Thanks, Mike. There was an early question from Peter Nicholas about modern buildings, and he asked about the R2000 building standard. And he asked what is its current status, and also maybe you could briefly explain what the R2000 standard is.
I can't. I've heard of it. I know that it is nowhere. It is what is responsible for the rather interesting, dramatic reduction in energy use per square meter by existing buildings built since 2015 than buildings built, say, before 1946. But I don't know any numbers on it. I think it achieves typically around a 30%, 35%. But I'm not. This is not my expertise, if I have any. So I can't really answer your question.
Thank you. I should mention that at least in Toronto, several SCAN members are meeting with members of Toronto Council, talking to them about Transform TO, educating them, hoping to recruit them. Where does the city stand? Do you know, Toronto or perhaps other cities, on actually making a heating plan? Is this something that is being considered?
I can't tell you. I can't believe that it's not being considered, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence of it. I have pressed Toronto a couple of times to do this. I was very impressed by a presentation made 18 months ago by Fernando Caru, who was in David McMillan's position. In fact, David McMillan then reported to him, and has now left to go and work in housing in the city, in the Toronto Housing Authority. And his last presentation said we have to break out of the 5% box. And he explained what he meant. At the moment, what's happening in Toronto is, what's happening in Toronto is looking at a lot of new buildings and a lot of incremental projects, but no overall plan, no dramatic plan, no what we are now calling a thermal energy plan. And he said, if we keep along our existing path, we're never going to get more than 5%, and we need 70% or more. In fact, we did a study in Toronto in 1995 showing how we could have 100% district energy. And that is available on our website if you want to read that study. It has a lot of dependence on nuclear heat, but it was done mainly under the auspices of what was then Metro Toronto and Natural Resources Canada. And so there's been a lot of talk. But as David McMillan said, when he spoke to you, he had a chart or a table, and he showed three columns. One column was almost no district energy. One column was some district energy interests, and one column was dealing with it seriously. And he said that we were somewhere near the middle of the first, between the first two. Meaning we're not doing very much and we're not getting very far. I'm hoping that will change soon. I'm hoping that our March 20th conference provided an impetus for this, but I can't give you any detailed results yet. Where I think there is more happening than in Toronto, but I may be wrong, is in Durham region. But not a lot is happening there either. But I think they may be further along what you might call a rational path to net zero in buildings.
Thank you. Gail Fairley, you have a question. If you could unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm just wondering about putting district thermal energy, distributed energy under these communities that are single family homes, and the difference between that and then doing tall buildings that are on gas now.
Yeah. There's a problem. I mean, it's quite complicated. The taller buildings are usually much newer than the single family homes.
I left you a message.
I know. I was listening to what he was saying.
Sorry?
About that.
This is an age problem here. I think it depends, and of course the tall buildings can be close to each other or far apart, and you would need to know the circumstances. But if you look at a place like Copenhagen, there's a no bigger share of apartments there than in Toronto. It's roughly 50% in a little over 50% in both cases, although they don't have as much high-rise stuff as we have. But what it does mean is that they have a lot of single-family homes there, and almost every one of those single-family homes has district heating. So it's not out of the question, but it does depend very much on particular circumstances. The other thing is that when you have big buildings, you get very odd things happening, like all these high-rise office buildings in downtown Toronto actually require cooling throughout the winter. You may have heard this, because the interiors of those buildings, unless they're especially designed, and I only know one that is designed in this way, and that's the former Ontario Hydro building at Queen's Park and College. Unless they're especially designed, their interiors get overheated with human heat and even more with electronic heat. And what they're doing is applying heating to the exterior from outside and cooling to the interior, both from outside, because they don't have a means of working it out within the building. This stuff gets very complex with big buildings, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. We have until about 3:00 for discussion with Richard. I have one additional question, which I don't know if it's possible to answer, but is it possible to compare the cost to the homeowner or building owner of district energy as compared to gas? Will it cost less?
I think this is something we're working on now, this minute, trying to pull together some conclusions from the work that we've done. I think what the people who are working on this are saying is that probably the way it's going to settle down is that district energy is going to cost about 45% more than gas. Okay. And that electricity is going to cost around 100 to 125% more than gas. Okay. So if the all electric solution and the district energy solution, in terms of the homeowner, that is different from the way I looked at it before. I was looking at it from the total amount of investment required, and that doesn't pan out in exactly the same way. So the answer to your question is no. I mean, natural gas is ridiculously inexpensive in terms of, and of course, we were, as a country, we were trying to remedy that by having this so-called carbon tax and creating more of a level playing field in terms of its impacts and so on. And of course, that's gone by the board, and no doubt some people are feeling very guilty about that, but that's how it's happened. If you look at natural, I don't have the numbers just in my head, but if you look at what my sister pays in Bristol for natural gas and what a homeowner would pay here, I think it's about 3 or 4 times the amount. I'm not sure about that, but I know it's a lot more
Thank you.
per unit of gas. I mean, yeah.
Karen Stows, you have a question, and I know you typed it in the chat, but it's about City Council, and you're from Kingston, so perhaps I can ask you to voice your own question. So
thank you. Okay, so in terms of a simple letter, who in the City Council would be the person to contact with concerns about the city's heating plans?
I don't know. In Kingston, we don't have any contacts in the city administration that I know about. We have one contact at Queen's, and I forget his name. Maybe Warren maybe. He's a prof in engineering, Maybe. And I have 2 members of my family who were at Queen's, one teaching and one doing a degree, but they were nowhere near engineering, nowhere near this stuff. One was political science, one was geography. I don't know anybody on council. And I can't answer that. But my general approach is only to deal with councillors when you have dealt with staff. Again, I can't be helpful. I don't know who staff, but I would figure out who the equivalent of the commissioner of works or the head of the works department is, or some, and maybe get some pointers from there. And then they will, at a certain point, point you to a councillor, and you can go saying, yes, your head of department has said we should come and talk with you, and you'll be much better informed. Councillors have, I mean, I don't know again about Kingston Council. No. They may have nothing to do, but councillors in Toronto, especially since the size of council was reduced, have just so much to do. It's become an almost impossible job.
Thank you.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
Well, you just before somebody else has a question?
Yes, we do. Karen Kempton.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute. So the question about natural gas, do we know when you begin to explore this, how much, because there seem to be lots of subsidies going into natural gas if we examine, the banks and the pension plans. So I'm wondering how much of their cheapness is because they are given one preferential treatment in amortizing their infrastructure and getting a lot of subsidies from pension plans, from the government, and so on. How much of that results in their cheapness? I'm sorry, I can't think of the other word, but I know what you mean. I know pension plans are looking for places for investment, and I know our teachers' plan has, become invested in WAVE and possibly even in the Bristol. The place for pension money might be in these kinds of, I guess you've called them utilities. I don't know if Toronto Hydro would be that type of utility where they could add investment money, but given all that, would there still be that high difference between, say, natural gas and district energy? Just curious.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers. I know the numbers exist. People have spent a lot of time adding up the subsidies that fossil fuels have, and You know, the biggest example we have in Canada recently is the federal government's expenditure on the Trans-Canada, whatever it is, that pipeline out in the west that started off at 5 billion and is now about 35 billion. They reckon they're going to get their money back, but I'm not sure. But I think the situation in Canada is that as a producer and as an experienced fossil fuel manager, our gas would be cheap anyway. The one country that we were in that was the most like Toronto was the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands is an interesting case because they had Europe's biggest natural gas field in Groningen in the north. And that natural gas field, the previous government, leftish government, they've got a rightish government and things have changed, but the previous government wanted to close it, partly because for environmental reasons, but also for the very particular reason that there was a strong suspicion that it was damaging properties, with minor earthquakes and so on caused by the natural gas. The situation in Amsterdam, which was getting roughly 85% of its heating power from this gas field, is rather like we have, except they already had maybe about 15% district energy, and we have less than 2%. And their natural gas was relatively, because it was homegrown and just piped within the Netherlands, which is rather small, their natural gas was relatively cheap. I can't remember a particular number, but compared with the rest of Europe that was suffering from not getting their gas from Russia and so on. So if I were to do a study of this, I would look at Europe generally, I'd look at the Netherlands in particular, and I would look at all the research that's been done on subsidies, which is quite a bit, but I don't have an answer at the moment. I suspect that it would be cheap in Canada anyway.
You're muted, Don.
Patrick McCauley, you have a question, and then Ron.
Yes, there's a fair bit of energy being expended these days on trying to cancel Line 5, which supplies much of the gas right now to certainly southern Ontario. And I'm just wondering if that effort succeeded and Line 5 were to be closed, would that act as a catalyst for putting more effort into district heating?
It could. I don't know how much of what share of Ontario's natural gas. I don't know how dependent we are on Line 5, but it's the kind of. I mean, we're vulnerable. There's almost no natural gas produced in Ontario. I think less than 1% comes from the one gas field or the two gas fields we have in southwest Ontario. So we're vulnerable, and that's another reason. I mean, once you're getting into district energy, even when you're getting into electricity, we're more self-sufficient in Ontario.
I can just add a small thing to that, which is that in Enbridge's last application for rate increase, they cited the source of gas used in Ontario, and over 70% of the gas that we burn in Ontario comes from the United States.
That's
true. It isn't piped through the United States.
Through the United States.
It is sourced from the United States.
It's sourced from the United States.
That's correct.
Oh, I thought it only came through. I'm not sure about this. Could I just say one thing that puts me at a little bit of a issue with some organizations and maybe with SCAN here as well. I think the key thing we have to do between now and 2050 is to get our thermal networks in place. And as we progressively get our thermal networks in place and can distribute hot water that comes from a variety of sources, we're going to be in a strong position. But in the course of getting our thermal networks in place, we may have to use natural gas. because in certain areas it may be the most expedient way of producing the hot water while we're sorting other things out. So I think it's important to reduce natural gas as far as possible, and certainly completely by 2050. But in the meantime, it may be necessary, in the way that it's become necessary to provide for electricity from natural gas generation, it may be necessary also to do as they are doing in some places in Europe, where chiefly they're switching from coal to natural gas, but they're using natural gas as the bridge fuel. I think the really key thing here is to get those thermal networks in place. The pipes that are carrying hot water and cold water around. And once you have those, then the opportunities are going to be huge. And if an interim step is to initially provide hot water with natural gas, so be it. I wouldn't fuss too much about that.
Thank you. Ron, thanks for your patience. Please ask your question.
Yeah, I think Richard has touched partly on the question, but from the point of view of an individual homeowner who's running on gas currently and considering a heat pump, Richard, are you saying that your efforts might be better placed in advocating for more widespread district energy in one's community than investing in the heat pump?
There's such a difficult question, and I sympathize. I mean, I have friends and acquaintances who've switched over to heat pumps already, thinking they were doing well. If given the present situation in Ontario and the one that's likely to be the case for the next 7 years, with the higher natural gas use for electricity production, I would say that the evidence is pretty clear that switching to a heat pump is going to cause more emissions than going to a very high efficiency natural gas furnace. And I pointed you to a source on that, and that calculation has been done a couple of times. It's fairly robust. That situation will not last, and once we get to sometime in the 2030s, whether it's the beginning or the end or the middle, I don't know. We're going to be using a lot less natural gas for that purpose, and it would be better to use heat pumps. But then at that time, we are going to be confronted by higher prices, partly because so many people are switching to heat pumps. So it's a big dilemma for a homeowner that has a 15-year-old natural gas furnace that is reaching the end of that life. They usually last 15 to 20 years. Is reaching the end of that life, and I don't know what to do. I think in any case, they should be advocating for district energy. That will give them much better options, but they're not going to get district energy for another 5 or 6 years at the best. So it's a very hard decision. And one thing I would like to see is this is something that is going to be an increasing challenge for homeowners and property owners generally. And city councils should be looking more at that kind of thing in Toronto.
Thank you, Richard.
Richard, that's wonderful, and I think we'll just leave it at that question because we have Shoshanna Saxe waiting for us, and we would like to take a little break. So thank you again, Richard. That was very helpful and thorough, and very grateful for that. So I think we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll reconvene at 3:15. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
I'm going to stay and listen to Shoshanna. But I'll be back in a minute. Thank you.
Great.
Is Our next speaker, Dr. Shoshanna Saxe, will present some of the ways that embodied or upfront carbon in construction can be minimized. A question and answer will follow Dr. Saxe's presentation. Please put your questions in the chat as before. Dr. Shoshanna Saxe is an associate professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering and Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in Sustainable Infrastructure. And she investigates the relationship between the infrastructure we build and the society we create to identify opportunities and pathways to better align infrastructure provision with sustainability. Her research focuses around two main questions: what should we build and how should we build it? Very important questions. Welcome, Dr. Saxe.
Thank you very much for having me. So I understand that you've already had a primer on life cycle assessment and embodied GHG. Today, we're going to be talking about embodied GHG in the whole systems of buildings that we need to build. But specifically, just to go over what we mean when we say that, when we're talking about the embodied greenhouse gas emissions or the embodied carbon in a building, what we're or anything we make, what we're talking about is a combination of these three factors. So one, the quantity and type of materials we use. So if you're using bricks or concrete, how much brick do you need? How much concrete do you need? What type of brick or concrete is it? What type of steel? What type of wood? The energy required to place those materials on site or to get them to site, and then also the impact factor of the manufacturing of that product upstream. So for cement, actually, I'll do steel. For steel, we have to mine iron ore out of the ground. Mining iron ore out of the ground takes machinery, which requires energy, usually fossil fuel based, that makes emissions. Then we have to transport the iron ore to a factory that is usually powered by a vehicle using fossil fuels, that makes emissions. Then we get the iron ore into the factory and we have to heat it up to a really high temperature to start turning it into steel. That high temperature, usually also fossil fuel based, that makes emissions. And then the chemical reaction that takes place in turning iron ore into steel releases CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, which is called the process emissions, is the chemical reaction, which we can't solve just by changing how we produce our energy. And so we see for steel and concrete, it's not perfectly half and half, but about half comes from process, half comes from energy, a little bit comes from transportation and mining on site. And then by the time we get that concrete or steel or wood or brick to a construction site to start building something, all of these emissions have happened upstream. They're embodied emissions. So it's not necessarily that they're like sitting inside the material. It's that the process of getting to have that material, that piece of construction required all of this to happen upstream. Every single product we make has upstream emissions. There's no such thing as making a construction material without emissions. Just like my cell phone has upstream emissions, my sweater has upstream emissions. And that's what we mean when we're talking about embodied carbon. So when we think about the problem of the limits of the environment or climate change as a whole, greenhouse gas emissions, one of the most helpful ways to think about it, I think, is the donut economic framing. So there's the things that we need for social function, for economic function. We need shelter, we need food, we need other things that require manufacturing, health, education, and all of those require some amount of consumption, right? If we all stayed home, did nothing, ate nothing, made nothing, there would be no emissions. But we want to live as full humans. That requires stuff of some kind. And that becomes the inside of our donut that pushes us to consume, to make energy, to do things. And then there's the outer end of the donut, which is the limit of what the world we live in can tolerate, with all kinds of limits in terms of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions. And the safe operating space is the space in between those two, where we meet our social and economic needs, but we don't screw the planet. And so in my research, we look at the donut for the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, where the inside of the donut is how much we need to build. We need maintenance. We need more public transit. We say in Canada over and over again, we need 5.8 million more homes. So we know we need to build more than we have been building. But also we have the climate limits, or in this case, a greenhouse gas budget, which is the maximum we can allocate to construction emissions. And then the safe operating space, the tasty part of the donut, is what we're looking at our research for ways to use urban forms. So urban planning, architectural design, structural design, material selection, both how we make our neighborhoods and how we make our buildings, how we make our communities to fit in between these two limits. And those are the big questions that I ask in my research. How can we, on one hand, do more to meet our infrastructure deficit, and less on the pollution side? This is really important when it comes to resource use and construction, because resource is a growing part of our driving emissions. So whereas resources were only 15% of the emissions in 1995, they were already about 23% by 2015, and the latest numbers are closer to 40% by 2025. So it's been accelerating really fast, that a big part of what is driving our environmental challenges right now is the consumption of resources. And of course, we consume resources not only for construction, but construction is a biggie, and it does a little bit less than half of all of that. So they say about 17 to 20% of global emissions every year are coming from things like construction now. So we were able to take a look in Canada and say, given the things we build, just in terms of resource consumption and construction, how much emissions are we emitting every year in Canada just to build things? And we found on the latest data available, so this is data from 2018, so pretty good to what we're doing now, probably a little bit low. We were on a consumption basis in terms of all of the materials we're using, even if they're manufactured in another country, about 90 megatons of emissions every year. And this works out to about 1/10 of Canada's production emissions every year. But we also know that we were building much less than we needed, right? This is leading us to the infrastructure deficit we currently had. About 40% comes from residential structures, about 40% comes from infrastructure, so roads, water pipes, the things in between. That also includes things like the oil sands and mineral extraction. And then another 20% comes from non-residential buildings. And when we look at where most of these emissions is happening, you can see what materials they come from. So concrete, metals, and wood are really our big materials driving emissions. Then we also just the design services, running the lights, having the buildings we design and work in. MEP is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. We see asphalt, that's from roads. And then you can also see what structures they're heading into. Again, similar as last graph, most going into residential construction here in beige, and then where in the country, with most of the emissions happening in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia.
Excuse me, Dr. Saxe, there's a bit of problem with the slides. Is it possible to try, it's hard to read because the way the screen layout is, and I'm wondering if we could try resharing, because it's coming out, the slides are very small on the screen.
Oh, I can stop sharing my face. I can share a different way. Okay, 1 second, I'll reshare. How's that?
Thank you.
Okay, great. So this led us to this challenge, which is just to keep in mind. The first bar chart is how much emissions we were emitting for construction in 2018, with the stuff that's hashed out, the things we were importing from other countries. So the solid bars are just what was being manufactured in Canada. If we just say that needs to be reduced by 40%, evenly all sectors do the same, the second bar is what we have left in 2030. If we said at the same time from 2018, we need to have 3.6 times as much housing produced in a year as we did that year. So we'll just multiply, scale linearly everything up by 3.6 times. That leads us to the third bar, which you can see is the tallest. And there's a huge gap then in between if we just scaled up business as usual construction to where we need to go. And then even our materials will get better, right? We're getting better at making concrete, we're getting better at making steel, we're getting better at making insulation. Even if those get better by 25% by 2030, that still leaves us with a huge gap. So we have this tension that emerges in between what we need to build, what we say we want to build, and our climate commitments. And so there's many ways to manage this. We could say, well, other sectors need to get better faster so that construction can pollute more. Though at this point, we're looking at construction being like 40% of what Canada can emit in 2030. That's a lot. We could say, well, screw the climate. We could say screw housing affordability, or we could say we have to start doing things differently. So I'm going to go with mostly the last one. How could we do things differently to build both more and pollute less? So this brings us to thinking about the other side of the donut, which is how much is enough? Canada says we need to build 5.8 million homes. we haven't really specified what that means, right? We know we don't mean 5.8 million studio apartments. We know we don't mean 5.8 million 7-bedroom mansions with a 6-car garage. But what do we mean, right? What is enough? What would we describe as good housing? You know, one of the most rapid scales up of housing in Canada was really in the 50s and the 70s. In the 50s, we built a lot of 2- and 3-bedroom single or single and a half story cottages. You still see them all around the country. They are much, much, much smaller than what we build now. In the 70s, we had a huge boom of 3- and 4-bedroom apartments, which provide some of the most affordable housing in Ontario. Those are very different than what we build now. So what do we mean? This is data from the US, but Canada is the same. Our homes have gotten much bigger and actually not taller, mostly just wider, while the number of people living in them have gone down. The average detached home built in Canada, in Ontario now, is 100% bigger than one built in the 1950s and 30% bigger than one built in the 1990s. So when I was a kid growing up, the average home being built then, the average single family home, was 30% smaller than it is now, and families were bigger. So we're building more space, but fewer people are living in them. And this is one of the challenges, is as our families get smaller, we need more housing per capita than we used to need. Another way we could look at how much is enough, and not just history, but also looking at just, well, what are legal minimums? Have there been any thinking about this in the past? And all around the world, there are laws about what makes for legal minimum space. So we say 9 square meters, which is about 90 to 100 square feet per person in Toronto. England and Spain have come up with bigger numbers. France sometimes has smaller numbers. In the global sufficiency research, so people who've tried to think and say, you know, what would be a good life, they say about 15 square meters per person, about 150 square feet per person. I live in a home that's about 1,500 square feet with my husband and my 2 kids. And so we need 11 roommates by that standard, if any of you are available. But it's also a question of design, you know, how the space is used. And so we need to balance between these things. Canadians live in some of the most space in the world. We live in about 60 square meters a person, which is, you know, a lot bigger than most other people. In Asia and Hong Kong and China, people live much closer to that 15 square meter number. When you start talking to lawyers about things like this, you get sentences like this one, which are not necessarily the most actionable. And this is from a paper I published with 2 lawyers. And you know, we want to be able to do the things that make a home, but it's very hard to come down to a hard number on what these things should be. And the lawyers found it very uncomfortable. They're like, well, we don't really, you know, it's not really up for us to say it should be 12 or it should be 25. And I was like, I'm an engineer. We have to come up with a number. And when we looked down under what was the basis of these numbers, it was mostly just guesses and vibes. And the 21 meters at the bottom is my best example of where these laws sometimes come from. So in the UK, they have a law historically about how far apart 2 houses can be from each other in the backyard. And it was based on 2 men in white shirts walking away from each other until they could no longer see their nipples through their shirts. And you know, you laugh, but British planning laws got imported all over the world. And so this is the kind of thing our laws and planning laws are still based on. And so when people say, well, we need to change the way we design communities, we need to change the way we design buildings to make them more sustainable, and people say, well, it's always been this way, remember that some of the ways it's always been is based on men's nipples through white shirts. So with that preamble, can we find a pathway between these problems? And so one of the first things we needed to do was understand how much emissions we currently are emitting in the things we build. And for the past 6 years, maybe more now, I guess 7 years in my research group, we've been studying buildings, making very detailed 3D models and quantifying the GHG emissions in different types of buildings. And so you can see here on the y-axis, we have embodied greenhouse gas emissions per bedroom, which was a sort of a proxy for how many people can live in a space. And there's this huge variation. The only thing I want you to take from this graph is that buildings vary a lot from one to another. And we've also looked for different styles of buildings in different places around the world. And again, the only thing I want you to take from this graph is buildings vary a lot from one to another. But one of the biggest things that we found is bigger buildings obviously have more emissions, right? So if you have a big single family home and 3 people living in it, you're going to have more emissions per person than even if you just have a reasonably sized single family home or a 1950s sized single family home with 3 people living in it. We've also looked into, is it possible, could we just replace all of our materials with recycled construction materials, which is something that people talk about a lot. Like, couldn't we just recycle more? And the thing is even if we're wildly optimistic, the answer for us in Canada at the moment is basically no. Because we need to build so much more than we tear down, we can't just recycle construction materials to build new buildings. We are going to have to keep using construction materials. So we have to be good stewards of them. It's a little bit different in other countries, like in France or in Northern Europe, where they tear down both a lot of older buildings. They have more older buildings than we do, and their population isn't growing as fast. So there it would be sort of 50%. For us, it's a much, much smaller percentage. So we cannot just recycle our way out of this problem. The other thing we looked at is, well, when we retrofit existing buildings to have more units, does that go better? And the answer is yes. So you can see the green bars here are smaller than the purple bars. So when we take an existing building and we add more units into it, it does cost less GHG per new unit than just building totally from scratch, but also not always. And mainly it was better to retrofit single family homes or buildings with a small number of units than it was to try and put more units into buildings with a lot of units. So if a building already has 20 units, getting more units into it is pretty close to building new. Whereas if you have like a single family home and you split it into 2, then you get a lot for low GHG. So another thing we did, this is one of the major efforts we've done in the last few years, is we modeled every neighborhood in the entire country if we were going to build it with that urban form now. So the urban form would stay the same, but we'd use modern construction materials and modern construction techniques. And if we looked at all of the embodied GHG in the buildings and in the roads and in the water to serve those buildings, how much GHG emissions would it take to build the entire country? And then we could use that as examples for how we should build in the future. So we looked at the data as a whole, and we found first that most of the GHG comes from housing. So if you see the graph at the top, it's shifted to the right over the other one. So generally in a neighborhood, most of the embodied GHG is in the buildings. But in some neighborhoods, you can see the second orange hump for the roads. It's sometimes in the roads. So it's usually a step down from buildings to roads, but if you have a lot of roads, it'll count roads too, and then a step down from roads to water. So the thing we need to worry about the most is the buildings, then the transportation infrastructure, then the water infrastructure. And the other thing we found is that the more single family homes you have in a neighborhood, the higher the percentage of single family homes, the more embodied GHG in everything. There's a range, as you can see this big blue bar, but as you go higher along single family homes, the worse it gets for across the board. And similarly, as a neighborhood gets denser, as more people live in a neighborhood, the lower GHG emissions we have per capita, because you get the benefit of shared infrastructure, shared spaces. And if you have attached buildings, you have fewer walls. So the more sharing in resources there is, the less embodied emissions there are. And so what this looks like if we start looking at neighborhoods is generally in sort of the traditional subdivision, we see about 26,000 kilograms of CO2 per person embodied in the built form. If we look at even like slightly denser attached approaches, so row houses, you see about half that. When we're looking at tall buildings, again, it's about half. This neighborhood has a lot of open park space, and so there's a bit of a disproportionate infrastructure in that particular picture. And again, in other tall neighborhoods, you see, again, about half. It tends to range. As soon as we move away from single family to anything else, things get much, much better. And we see these patterns repeating around the country. So this is from Edmonton. Similarly, in the single family neighborhoods, we see 27,000 kilograms per person, so 26, 27. As soon as you move away from that to any kind of multi-unit form, tall, wide, it gets better. Montreal repeats the pattern, and the single best neighborhood in the entire country we found in terms of GHG was the Plateau area in Montreal, which is very high density with almost all multi-unit buildings. And they're low, so they're built out of light materials. And you tend to have an apartment per floor. This is where I lived when I was an undergraduate student. So you have an apartment per floor, but it also ranges over a huge area. There's a lot of them. And one thing that you'll hear people say a lot is, well, we just need to build neighborhoods like the Plateau. But something that I would keep in mind is a lot of the country we're trying to retrofit. So if we're building a new greenfield site, sure, like let's build it like the Plateau or like other low GHG European style neighborhoods. But if we're retrofitting the city of Toronto, for example, we would have to knock down half the city to turn it into the Plateau. We have to work with what we already have, in which case building fewer taller buildings fits in better with less tearing down of the city. So it depends. Are we talking greenfield or retrofit? When we look across the country, the single worst neighborhood is on the East Coast. This is not a farming community. It's just a place where people live on farm-sized lots. And so there's a huge amount of infrastructure per person. Then we see a lot of the single family homes. And then you get down to sort of 10,000 kilograms per person to 16 with any kind of multi-unit neighborhoods. And the best one being this one neighborhood in Montreal. So our next questions were, well, everything we've studied so far, can we find a pathway to do both? And so we looked at these 5 different pathways. So one, change the form of neighborhoods being built. So not single family, suburbs, really anything else, anything multi-unit. Design better buildings. So there's you saw all of those variations between one building, just design to the best ones. Improve material manufacturing, repurpose existing buildings better, and build where the infrastructure already exists. So more infill construction, so we don't have to build more infrastructure. So if we build business as usual, that's where the CMHC baseline is. So if we build just the dark blue, we will dramatically mess up our need for housing affordability with all the social instability that comes with that, right? We see how angry young people are now, that how hard it is for them to find somewhere to live. If we go to the high growth scenario in business as usual construction, we end up at the top of the purple. And I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers because this is just A1 to A3 and doesn't include MEP, but this is the scale. They're all in the same scale, so they're all comparable. So if we start looking at changing neighborhood form, so go from single family neighborhoods to any other form. And again, this includes tall towers, really anything else. It makes a third of the difference we need to make. So we make that change from 26,000 kilograms per person to 10 to 16,000 kilograms per person just by making that one change. We don't even have to change our technology, nothing else, just one change stands by itself. Another thing we can look at is changing how we manufacture materials and also changing the types of materials we use. So our steel and concrete industry they're not world leading by any measure, but they're trying to do better. They're working on that. We have a nationally agreed pathway to low GHG cement working. I think there's either one that just came out or is soon going to come out for steel. We can use nature-based materials for things like insulation instead of hydrocarbons. And just all of this change together at its most optimistic will, by the early 2030s, improve about 25%. But because time goes by in the meantime, that actually doesn't do a 25% change for us now because we're going to build things this year and next year and the year after. So by 2030, it does about 10% of what we need. We could also design better. Right. So when we're building, if we're going to make single family homes, instead of making them ginormous and huge wastes of space, make them smaller, don't have basements. When we're designing big buildings, make them boxy with no transfer slabs. When we're designing mid-rise, use single stair, don't have a huge amount of underground parking. Underground parking is the single most polluting thing we build. So parking bad, we should not have parking. If we design better, that does another third. And again, we're now really only talking about things that we already know how to do. We know how, or are already happening. So we know how to design better. We know how to change form. We're not really doing those, but technically they're easy. We're improving materials. Technically that's hard, but we're working on it. But that will not be enough by itself. Okay, so we've made it most of the way there. We need a couple other strategies to help us in. So another one is infill, build more units where we already have them. So have single family neighborhoods, build garden suites, basement suites where there are already basements, subdivide existing buildings to have more units. This is particularly powerful when you can build where the infrastructure already is. So now we can use the roads, we can use the sewers. We don't have to build massive new roads, massive new sewers. And then we're almost at the line. And then the final strategy is split what we already have, the renovation approach. And this is particularly effective if we split single family homes into multiple units. It can be for rental, it can be for different owning, it can be to facilitate multi-generational living, which lots of people, want their kids to be able to live nearby. But we have, as I said, way bigger homes with way fewer people living in them, so that we have a lot of unused space that could be multiple units. And that is much lower GHG, especially when we do it at the scale of, not really big buildings. And that gets us under the line. So these are all technically possible, happening. They don't require new inventions. They don't require any magic. We can do these things. We just have to be willing to do them. It would require a different approach to the way we develop communities than what we have done in Canada or North America for much of the last few generations, but it is technically totally possible. And it aligns with our housing crisis really well in terms of all of these things lead to cheaper, more affordable communities. If we put the numbers all together, we modeled a worst case scenario where almost everything new housing we build is single family homes, a business as usual scenario, and a best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, we would be building just in residential about 94 megatons a year. And just for scale, Canada's GHG budget in 2030 is 443 megatons. So just residential construction would be a quarter of that, without accounting for all the things I said are excluded here. If we do business as usual, it'll be about 57, but if we do the best case, it'll be 8. So the scale of change we can make here is more than 10 times. And then the cumulative emissions also follow. So what? If I was going to leave you with any messages, one thing that we need to keep in mind is we have to build smaller and denser. That doesn't mean worse. It just means different. We need to design better. We tend to have oversized spaces in North America because we have really shitty design. And so if we have better design spaces, they can be awesome and wonderful and aspirational and great just by using our resources more efficiently, right? Like if you've ever been to a hotel room and you're like, oh, it's so well laid out, or if you've ever been on a cruise and you're like, actually, this works for me, or when there are space pressures, we can design really well. We need to pursue low GHG materials, especially where they're widely available already. Low GHG insulation is widely available. It's a really good substitute material. Other materials like low GHG steel or concrete or even wood substitution, the math is a little bit tougher, but on insulation, it's just a clear win. We are probably going to need other sectors to improve faster. We're going to need transportation, which is pretty easy to decarbonize at this point. We need more public transit, more biking, more electric cars, so that we can make more space for construction, so that we can build all of the things we want. Construction is a hard to decarbonize sector, and we need to give it some breathing room by improving faster in other areas. We're going to need more and better public space so that people don't need to privatize their space so much, right? If you have an awesome community center nearby, you don't necessarily need a rec room or a swimming pool or a playground in your backyard for your kids if you are safe, great places for them to go. And we see all around the world that people are very happy to live differently than we live when they have access to good public amenities. And so that's something that we need to start taking really seriously. Our design crappiness tends to extend beyond the home and into the public realm. But there are all kinds of co-benefits to this. We only have so many construction workers and only so many construction worker hours in a year. If we're building oversized, we're using them to not produce that much housing. It's cheaper and faster to build if we build smaller. You can build it with fewer tradespeople. When we build denser, it costs less to build the infrastructure and maintain it. The tax requirements of low density neighborhoods is so much higher than the tax requirements of even slightly higher density neighborhoods. If you want to pay higher taxes, you want subdivisions. If you want to pay lower taxes, you want more multi-unit neighborhoods. If we are constantly at risk of flooding now, basements, as I said, are some of the highest GHG emitting things we build. Underground parking, they're very, very prone to flooding. If we bring the things we build out of the ground, not only will it be better for the environment, not only will it be faster and cheaper to build, but we'll be less likely to flood. And as I said, when we have multi-unit buildings closer together and with a good public realm, our tax base goes further. A couple of years ago, I was traveling with my son, and he was then 7 in Germany. And he was like, "Mommy, why is it just better here? Like, why are the streets nicer? Why are the playgrounds nicer?" And I was like, well, let me tell you, if you have this many people living on a street and they're each going to pay $5, the $5 goes further when you have more people. And So we can do all of these things. We have all the know-how we need to build much more sustainable communities. The benefits of them are knock-on, but they do require us to let go of some of the orthodoxies of what we think is a nice place to live in Canada. And so with that, that's it for me. I would love to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Shoshanna. As coming from a family of engineers and lawyers, that was very edifying. And turn it over to Don Booth, who will deal with the questions. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Dr. Saxe. I have a couple of kind of questions in my pocket, but before I put my own forward, raise your hand if you have a question. And actually, there's one that I suspect others have, which is, Dr. Saxe, what are your thoughts about the new government plans to build lots of housing and to use some prefab?
So from a social standpoint, I think it's great. I think it's really good that we're staying serious about building lots of housing. I think it's important. I'm nervous about what it will mean for our future if we don't. I'm 40, and so I bought young, so I'm like the last generation to be able to afford somewhere to live. But people even 5 years younger than me, I see how upset they are and how angry. And so I think it's a really good thing. From an environmental perspective, prefab isn't magic. It can be great. It can be bad. So I think the policy has the potential to be a very good one from both the social and environmental standpoints, but there's more that we need on the delivery. The previous government did include considerations of embodied carbon in some of their efforts, and in the design guide, which the federal government started to release, which I'm hopeful will stay part of the conversation going forward. But one of the things which is really nice is the embodied carbon and the cost question are very well aligned. It is cheaper to build things that require less materials. It is cheaper to build things that aren't underground. It is cheaper to build things stick frame with well-skilled workers at a multi-unit rather than single family. And so I'm hoping that alignment will stay and that we could get very good policy out of this. I think the previous government was also doing a good job in saying that if we're going to give you money to build housing, you have to loosen up your zoning rules. And that's also really, really important. So I am cautiously optimistic. The proof will be in the pudding. And if anyone knows anyone in the government and they want to talk, I'm here for it.
That offer of your willingness to speak with the government and those who are planning these programs is meaningful because you actually know what you're talking about, as opposed to people like us, most of whom mean well but don't have your weight. No, seriously. And I wonder if there is some discussion of perhaps yourself, Dr. Saxe, and others who you work with, of offering your services to the government in designing these new programs, which you probably need to do tonight.
Yeah, I mean, we're all over it in the attempts. Canada actually is not very good at taking advantage of academia directly. The US has historically been better at it. The UK has been better at it. There is a pretty big disconnect in between research and government in Canada. There are efforts to bridge it, and it's part of the reason why I think opportunities like this to talk to people are so important, because the more people know things, the more things get known. And so one of the things I try to do in my career is just talk about the work as much as possible. I also recognize that these are multi-criteria, multi-challenge problems, right? If it was easy, we would have fixed it already. It's not that this isn't hard. And I know that the governments are juggling multi things at the same time. But one of the things I would say is you are in many ways the most powerful voices, right? You vote, you go to meetings, you call your counselors, you call your MPs and MPPs, and people take that really, really seriously. So I wouldn't undermine your power.
Thank you. I'm concerned that other members here are a little shy. Don't be shy. Thanks, Gail. Go ahead. You're muted. Gail, you're muted.
Yeah.
That's better.
Okay, that's better. I'm wondering about requiring whole life cycle carbon assessments before, at the early design stage, before it actually goes to be approved by municipalities or whatever.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering if that's a really good way of speeding things up in terms of getting developers and architects and just people in the community on board with building smaller and subdividing their homes.
Yeah, so there's a mix of things there. Both Toronto and Vancouver, for example, have increasingly in their green standards embodied carbon and whole life carbon limits, and those can be really impactful. There are some challenges with the way those rules are made, one of which is that they're made per meter squared. And so you don't actually gain anything by not wasting space. So that's one challenge with our regulations as currently written. And it's a really hard thing to get away from because, people could just say, well, I was going to build a bigger building, but now I'm going to build a smaller building, and you should give me credit for the embodied GHG emissions that it saves. So I think there is value in whole life carbon. There are no perfect metrics, but I think we also need to be thinking about GHG, like acceptable GHG costs per unit, which have to come down, because it's not just we need to do better relatively, we need to do better in total. But there's so many things we can do without a life cycle assessment that we know make it better. So, for example, don't heat with natural gas. If I'm going to pick up on the previous one, we know not to heat with natural gas. We can heat with other things. When we're talking about embodied carbon, don't build underground parking, right? Don't have an inside garage. Avoid transfer slabs. Don't waste space. So if we just do those things, a huge amount of the benefit can be manifest without needing the extra staff or extra skills that go into whole life assessment. So if we're talking about sophisticated developers in big cities, absolutely, I think they should have embodied carbon standards. But I think we also want to develop a norm where the things we're doing fast, the things with less regulation, the things that are in the suburbs of small community X that maybe doesn't have any staff, we know what the rules of them are. Don't heat with gas, no underground parking, no indoor parking at all, ideally. Reasonable forms, don't waste space.
Who else? Really, this is a very shy bunch. While others are screwing up their courage, one more question, which is there are now some pre-approved designs. I think they're coming from the federal government. I don't know where else pre-approved designs are available. Have you seen them? Can we look at them are they a good example?
So I'm not familiar with pre-approved designs. I'm familiar with the design catalog, but that's
what I'm referring to.
Okay. So the design catalog is this idea of the federal government putting out ideas of things that we should build lots of. And it would be really great if those came to the level of pre-approved designs, where if you build this, you can build it really easily and really cheaply. And when that type of things happen, you can tend to see a lot of rapid fire development of designs because it's easy, you're going to be allowed, and you just go for it. And frankly, at the moment, what we treat as pre-approved designs basically is single family subdivisions with a lot of parking, right? So those are very easy to build historically, like for the last few decades in Canada, and everything else is hard to build. So they're trying to change that story. They haven't yet gotten to the point of it being really pre-approved because that's a provincial jurisdiction. There are other places in the world that have done this to reasonable success. So I think it was Seattle in their garden suites programs, the idea where you could, build a second home in your backyard. They had pre-approved designs, and they had an architectural competition. They got a bunch of groups and where you'd pre-approve the design. And then if you wanted to build a garden suite you could pick one, you would pay a nominal fee to the architecture firm. So they would still make money for their work, but instead of making a lot of money for one, they would make a small money on each, but over more. And then the builders would know how to build it because they built it before, and it would just be easier for everybody to build. And of course, that's the idea also with manufactured housing or modular housing, is that you're doing the same thing over and over again. And by basically commodifying housing, you make it easier to build. And so that's the general idea. It can be great. The designs were considered for sustainability. I haven't seen the numbers. I think those are a good beginning, but we're going to need to be much more aggressive about it. And people also sometimes get really nervous, like, well, we don't want everything to look the same. So as I said, I live in this 1,500 square foot house that was built in 1903. My house looks exactly the same as many, many houses on the street. They were all built at the same time in a downtown Toronto neighborhood that people consider very desirable, because it's not that we mind everything looking the same. What we hate about subdivisions is that they have no trees and they're all parking garage, right? It's not that we like them all. We have no problem with them being the same. This is how housing gets built all over the world. We love about Paris or the fancy parts of London that it's all the same. Nice repetitively is fine.
Mike Green.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the interaction between embodied and operating emissions. So if you have a high rise that's maybe getting somewhat near end of life, and it maybe has low embodied emissions and high operating emissions, is there some need for coordination of, like, okay, when does it become important to make this reduce the operating emissions in some should this be a priority in terms of reducing the operating emissions? How do we deal with that interaction?
Yeah. So I have a good answer for this. I think you're going to like it. This is a question that people have been worrying about for the last 20 years, right? What's this trade-off between embodied carbon and operation emissions? If we make one better, are we going to make the other worse? And so there was a ton of research on this topic. And so we have really clear answers, which is great. It's always nice when the answers are clear. So buildings that are old and have bad mechanical electrical systems and not very much insulation are really ripe for retrofit, and the paybacks are fast, right? If you're heating on natural gas and your building is leaky and uninsulated, the paybacks tend to be 1 year, 3 years, maximum 5 years a lot of the time. And so a mechanical and electrical retrofit on a leaky and efficient building pays back really quickly. There can be questions of, should you do huge retrofits on a building that is at its end of life, right? So if the concrete's starting to crumble and you think you might have to tear it down in 10 years, maybe tear it down a few years earlier. But as long as the structure is reasonably solid, and you can check that out, the paybacks for mechanical and electrical retrofit are usually very, very good. The bigger challenge that we have right now, at least in Toronto, is that the easiest place to build more housing is where there's kind of already a lot of housing. And so the easiest place to build a 15-story or a 20-story building is where there's currently a 10-story building. And so then you have these big trade-offs of, should we take down the 10-story building to build the 20-story building? And that becomes very complicated because it depends what the counterfactual is. If the counterfactual is a subdivision in the outside of Oshawa, and apologies to anyone who might live in Oshawa, then absolutely it's better to tear it down and build the 20-story building. But if the counterfactual is, well, we have a second 10-story building right next door or somewhere else in Toronto, or we take down a couple large single family homes and build a 10-story building or a 20-story building, then that's better. And so we really need to loosen up what we're allowed to build where, so that we're not constantly just like sprawling at the edges and tearing down existing buildings to build other buildings. And the other thing I would say about sprawl, we can do urban sprawl so much better, right? We're pushing a lot of the best design into the reasonably sustainable neighborhoods anyway. We're going to keep building subdivisions for sure. We're going to keep building on greenfield. We should build the most kick-ass greenfield neighborhoods ever. They should be walkable. They should have awesome amenities. They should be really great, like people who build greenfield in so many other parts of the world. We have very high standards for what we build in the center of cities and very low standards for what we build on greenfields. We need to even these out. I think Richard has a question.
You're muted, Richard.
Muted.
There we are.
Can you say a bit more about mass timber construction?
Okay. I can say many things about mass timber construction, and I should probably caveat them, which I am probably the least into wood of any sustainable person you will ever meet. And wood, so with that caveat going, you may want to see other people's opinions as well. Mass timber construction is you take pieces of wood, you glue them together, it's a little bit fancier than that, to make big beams that you can build big buildings out of wood. This can be great in some ways. One, wood weighs a lot less than steel and a lot less than concrete. And a lot of what you're doing when you're building a building is holding up the other parts of the building, because it's called the self-weight of the building. That load is a big part of what you're doing with the building. You're holding up everything above it. The foundation is holding everything up above it. So mass timber, because it weighs less, requires less structure to just hold itself up less. So then it can have big savings from an environmental perspective because there's just less structure overall. It's lighter. And people get really excited about wood because it's a natural material, and when a tree is growing, it pulls carbon dioxide into the tree, and then if you turn that into a mass timber building or a timber building, the carbon dioxide doesn't rot when the tree falls, it goes into the building and it rots later, and so you get this idea that wood is sequestered in the building. Okay, here is where I think this conversation then goes off the rails. People then say, this building made out of wood is negative GHG emissions. It's magic. It's like carbon storage. If that was true, we should all quit what we're doing, cut down trees full time, and build buildings until climate change is solved. If that sounds ridiculous, then you're with me that this is not magic, that there is no such thing as building buildings until we have solved climate change, because there are emissions with everything we make. And so that is why I say that I'm a little bit annoyed about the mass timber conversation, is because there's this conversation that it's magic, we can just suck things into trees. Wood is a very, very powerful construction material, especially for shorter things. Like the stick frame buildings are some of the lowest GHG we can build, much lower than mass timber. And so the things that we can build with conventional wood construction are really powerful. And then we can do that up to 6 and 7 stories. We can do 4 stories with lots of units in them. There's a lot we can do with wood. The actual GHG emissions from all the data I've seen of mass timber buildings and well-designed concrete or steel buildings is that they're very competitive with each other. There will be people who completely disagree with me, but they are doing it based on the sequestration number, which I do not believe is solid science or math. And also we count in our GHG accounting every year a term called land use change in forestry. We have already counted that minus from the trees, and I don't think we should count it twice. But wood can be great. We should design it well. We should build wood. We should build it without a shit ton of parking, because then it's really polluting anyway. Apologies for the cursing. We should build lots of mid-rise and missing middle subdivisions, but we're also going to need really well-designed concrete and steel buildings. One final thing I would say is concrete and steel are getting better, right? Steel made with electricity is coming. Europe is taking it really seriously. There are startups starting to happen. They're not coming tomorrow, but I think they are coming. And so steel and concrete are going to get lower GHG. Wood is going to stay about the same, except maybe for the glue. And so they're going to get increasingly competitive with each other over time. Not this year, but probably in the 2030s. Sue.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I've heard a couple of times talking about allowing single staircase in buildings. And I mean, I've walked around a lot of apartment buildings, canvassing, and I live in a small apartment, well, actually a triplex now. I have 2 staircases, and I kind of think of it as a safety factor. And I think this would be particularly true of the larger buildings. Now, maybe they're fairly fireproof and you don't need to worry about it, but I'm looking at people living in these big buildings on Dawes Road, or generally anywhere in Toronto, and if there's a fire alarm, a serious one, how many people are going to be able to get out? Is that a non-worry? I mean, those corridors are quite long. You'd have to run quite a distance to get to a single fire escape.
Okay, so there's so many good questions there. Thank you for asking that. So a couple of things to keep in mind. When people are talking about single stair, they're not talking about 20-story or 30-story buildings. They're usually talking, max 6, maybe 8, but usually 6. And when you build single stair buildings, it's not that you have a corridor with one stair at the end. You completely change the way you lay out the building, which is the power of single stair. So instead of having long corridors where like you would go up to a floor and then it's a huge long corridor, you have just one stairwell and there's units that come off the stairwell. So there'd only be 4 units, let's say, coming off the stairwell for each corner. You would never have to walk down a long hallway. You would open your door, be in the stairwell. There might be an elevator surrounded by the stairwell, and then you go straight down. So you would never have to walk down the corridor 20 units. The whole point is to get rid of that central corridor so that you can use your space more efficiently, but also you can have like double aspect units where people can have light and air on both sides. It makes for nicer units. From a fire safety perspective, the fire safety data is comparable from places that have laws like we do to places that have modern single stair. So we're not saying we should return to the challenges of the tenements in the 1920s and let people die in fires. 100%, nobody wants that. But the thing is, we have gotten better at fire suppression. We've gotten better at sprinkler systems. We've gotten better at figuring out how to rescue people. And so the safety outcomes are the same in every time everybody has looked. Fire departments are very nervous about this in North America, and they will say we do not want it from a safety perspective, but the research data is that it's very similar. There are also compromises you can do where you put the hallway on the outside of the building. So instead of having an internal covered hallway, you still do have a second exit, but it's more like a connected balcony. And so you can still have light and air, but you just have a hallway outside with a stairway outside. And so you get the same safety benefits. The other thing I would say, and this is a little bit controversial, is there are many different types of safety. And sometimes we worry about some to the detriments of other kinds of safety. A classic example being, lots of parents drive their kids to school to keep them safe, but then they're less healthy, they learn less well, they're more, horrible things happen, like kids getting run over at drop off, right? So we tend to worry about one safety versus another. There are real safety and community issues of the fact that we're making housing so expensive, of climate change, that our double stair rules are making worse. And it's a trade-off. Even if the data was it would make things a little bit less safe, we're right now only worrying about one kind of safety, but also the data is that it's very, very parallel and that we can change the way we design and make single stair totally safe.
Thank you. Norman Park, and then Gail, and then we will be finished.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Shoshanna. My question is, it seems like one thing that we haven't talked about, or at least not talked about centrally, is speed. The speed of the transformation that needs to occur. Now, that did get mentioned with the pre-approved housing designs, but when you're talking about getting permitting and putting up large structures, there can often be a lot of resistance, and it can take a very, very long time for this change to occur. Have you thought about ways of speeding up the process of renewing our cities?
Yes, I've thought about it a lot. I don't have great answers because a lot of the problem is us. Right, the demand for consultation, the demand for the neighborhood association to have an opinion, we are in many ways the problem. And it's become a weird sort of extreme outcome of what was originally a really good thing, right? So if we go back to Jane Jacobs about the community should have a say, the community should be respected, right? That was, for starters, a really, really good thing. And now the dominant community voice that people hear is do nothing, change nothing, everything should be the same.
Right.
And that's a problem. And so I think number one, show up to community meetings and say, change is good. I like change. I think there should be more neighbors here. Like, I think we should build that building. I think it's important. I don't think we should make it 3 stories shorter because of the shadow it might cause 15 minutes on April 3rd. I think actually people should have places to live, right? it's really, really important to show up to meetings and say, change is okay, government official. I'm not going to yell at you. I'm on your team. That is one of our biggest barriers. And part of the challenge right now is that communities fight small change as much as they fight big change. So if you're a developer and you show up in a neighborhood and say, I want to build a 6-story building, you get fought just as hard as if you say you want to build a 25-story building. And because you get fought no matter what, and it's going to take you 3 years to get through the fight, you better ask for the 25-story building so that you end up with an 18-story building so you can make your 3-4% to be able to pay your employees and not go out of business. And the universal no as opposed to a default yes is a huge part of our problem. From a technical, once the engineers get involved standpoint, there are other things we can do to help with speed. Don't build in deep basements. Building in the ground is the highest risk, most expensive, slowest part of construction. So the more we can be out of the ground rather than in the ground, the faster things will go. Factory housing construction will help. There's a couple companies now. They changed their name. It was Our House, but now what are they called? There's a couple companies knocking things up faster, and they can do most of the construction offsite. And then you see a building materializes in 2.5 weeks, and that's pretty exciting. But really, really, when it comes to infrastructure of all kinds, we are the problem in how much consultation we demand, how much we say it should stay exactly the same as the time I was most comfortable. We are the problem. And we need to show up and say, I understand things have to change. I'm with you. Change is good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gail, you're muted. Gail, you're muted.
There. I'm wondering what you think about, I live right downtown near Liberty Village, and I was walking through there the other day, and they're putting up several, or more than several, more high rises. And to me, it's just a horrible living situation. And so I'm wondering what you think about, because what Toronto is doing is building more high rises where high rises are, and then not much is happening in the single family neighborhoods.
Can you tell what you think is horrible about it?
There's no space. You look and it's just building after building after building, and they're all tall. I don't know. I just don't think it's fit for human habitation to have. And there's a history too that those tall buildings have small apartments because a lot of them were built for investments. So how do you, because Toronto is really just seems to be going at full speed to get more high rises up where high rises already are.
Yeah, so I have many feelings about this. So I could do both sides of the argument. Yeah. So let me do the downside and then I'll do the upside. So the downside of the argument is that we are only allowing development in a few places, which means that there's a lot of construction disturbances concentrated in the same places. You get a lot of people using the same sewer, and those can be, if we spread it around more, it would be more even. For things like schooling, you get schools that are oversubscribed and ones in other parts of the city where there aren't enough kids in the school, which is a whole other challenge we could get into. But by and by, on the whole, I think we need to just take basically all development as good, and then work to make it the best possible development. We have such an intense population growth, and it's going to slow down now with restrictions on immigration, but we have so many people who need housing that we don't really live in a place where we should be saying no to anything. We should be saying yes, but better, or yes, and lots of people really like living in tall buildings. You don't have to maintain a yard. You have good facilities. You're downtown. I think Liberty Village needs better public transit. I think Real Deck Park would be great because there would be better access to parks. There's a lot of really cool restaurants and shops there. I took one of my kids to do a chocolate painting experience. And if you live near there, I recommend it. It's really fun and really creative, and then you get to eat it. There's good biking infrastructure. I think we need more. There was sort of 5-6 years ago a children's museum that was temporarily in Liberty Village, which I loved, and I think we need more of. So I think we need more things in Liberty Village, like more infrastructure, more opportunities, but we really need to stop fighting development because we are so behind. And we can't do it all in the single family neighborhoods. And we are going to need some tall buildings. And we shouldn't be tearing down all of our major streets because that's where the shops and experiences are. So it's going to have to go everywhere. Yes, it should be in the single family neighborhoods. Yes, it should be in Liberty Village. Yes, it should be at Eglinton and Yonge, but we should be providing more better public amenities to make the quality of life for everybody higher. And did they? Oh, I don't know if that's aimed at me.
Shoshanna, are you able to, there still are more questions. Are you able to stay a few more minutes or?
Yeah, I can stay like five or so more minutes.
Okay.
Then I got to do a school run.
Okay. Thanks.
Kai?
Hey, LG, and I'm sorry I don't have a camera, but no, I just wanted to reply to Gail because I've been curious about high neighborhoods because I live in a low-rise heritage conservation district in Waterloo, and I led a Jane's Walk on Friday. People who are living in higher rise condo buildings to see, did they still have community? Did they get to know their neighbors? And what I concluded was it's just like in the low rise. It takes somebody to take the initiative, and say, yeah, let's get together and have a barbecue, or let's get together and solve this problem. And the buildings where that happened, they had fantastic communities. Others, they said, oh, we don't have anything like that in our condo. So it was an eye opener for me, and I'd wanted to know this for years, and I'm glad I finally took the step to do the Jane's Walk. So try that next year, guys.
One thing I would add about high rise is we just finished a piece of research which is available on our website, looking at, is taller worse for embodied carbon? And basically what we found the answer is no. Designing better is better for embodied carbon, and you can design a 20-story building with the same embodied carbon as a 5-story building. It's just a question of design. And we mostly found that if you're designing a 9-story building, it might as well be 10. And a 5-story building might as well be 6. And a 6-story building might as well be 7. That the change is very, very small. The benefit that you get from saving on elevators and utilities and road space is big. And so we need to design well. And but the scale, we tested up to 20 stories. So I'm not sure it's the same at 60.
Yeah.
But big buildings, tall buildings can be great from an embodied carbon standpoint. As Karen says, they can be great for community. We need better design. I spent some time in Hong Kong after university. Everybody there lives in tall buildings, and you can have a very good quality of life. I've spent time in community where everybody lives short. I lived in Montreal where everything is a multi-unit building. There are many, many different ways to have really wonderful quality of life. And I think that's the thing that we need to loosen up on a bit. And the idea of the picket fence in the suburb with a 2-car garage delivers one quality of life, but we know it doesn't work for seniors to age in place in the long term or live near their kids. We know it doesn't work for the environment, and we know it's very expensive to maintain. And we've tried it, and it got us to where we are now. Now we need to try some other stuff.
Karen Templin, and that might be the end of your time.
Great.
Thank you. And thank you for this presentation. It was just overwhelming. I'm so impressed. But my question just builds a bit on Gail's comments about these high-rise buildings. I live in the Yonge-Eglinton corridor, and I can see the pros and cons. As Gail said, many investors and, unaffordable if they're owned by investor, insecure housing. The lack of planning, and I know the city is great at planning because I think developers got a little too much leeway and rope to build. I just find that it's unpleasant to walk in this neighborhood. We lost a great deal of green space and trees. Mid-range, what would we call them? Middle range, oh my goodness. Multi-residentials were taken down, like 20-story buildings. Many people were displaced in the process and not too sure they'll ever get back to a unit. I don't know where all that's going. The other thing that happened was at Yonge and Eglinton, that area is just a breathtaking wind tunnel. In winter, it's really brutal, the wind. And I don't know if better planning could have, mitigated that a bit, because I just feel there could be better planning done. There's a rush to get these buildings up, but I'd rather be walking north in in our residential neighborhoods, just because there are trees and it's greener, and for mental health, we know that that's all better. I feel like Yonge and Eglinton is a lot of concrete wall, and not, as far as people avoid them if they can. And I think we need more planning in these places to provide walkways and things like that, and planning to prevent things like the wind tunnels. Those are just some thoughts. And to use the mid-range buildings, to lose them was also, I think, not always for the best. I'll just leave it at that. But I wanted to add to Gail's comments with the.
Yeah, I really hear your concerns, and it's not that I think you're wrong. I think the question is, what is the counterfactual, and would that have been better? And so there are two possible counterfactuals. Right? Well, there's a couple. So one, we didn't get all of that housing, and we had even less housing in Toronto than we have now, which I think would be a social and environmental disaster. Two, the housing got built in subdivisions on greenfield, meaning we'd have lost a lot more farmland and a lot more forest land, which I think also would have been a social, economic, and environmental bad. Three was we could take that same amount of development and sort of peanut butter it more over the area. And so most of that development has been to the northeast of Yonge and Eglinton, and the neighborhood to the northwest is almost exactly, it's rich single family homes, almost completely unchanged. So let's say we could have knocked down that entire neighborhood, big chunk of Forest Hill, and put half of the development over there. Would that have been better? Maybe it would have been better. It would have been even more construction. It probably wouldn't have saved meaningful amounts of embodied GHG. It might have made for more European style neighborhoods. It would have probably killed more trees, but maybe would have left space for more trees now. But it also would have meant that everybody there, which would have had to sell and move, and they tend to be richer, more powerful, more informed than the multi-unit tenants on the other side. And those are really the other things that could have happened. I think that either what happened or the fourth one potentially would have been net better. But I think the middle two, which are the main things that happen when we refuse to build things, either it goes into sprawl or it doesn't get built at all, are really the counterfactuals that we're dealing with. And so I think that it's really important, if we're going to say no to something or we don't like something, that we can offer a realistic, better solution as a community that says, what is the other thing we really want to happen, right? It happens to me all the time where I do these talks and someone's like, oh, I think there's too much tall buildings. And sometimes it's planners from the community. We said a developer could build here and they're asking for more height than we wanted. And I said, well, how many places do you allow development in your community? And it's like, only on this little corridor. I'm like, well, if you say mostly no, people are going to push for as much as they can and the yes as they possibly can. And then everything's going to be tall. And so we have to get very seriously about saying yes to an abundance of things that we need, so that we have feet to stand on when we say no. Right now, we say no more. And I'm sorry to keep bringing up my kids, but my kids, what do you want to do? I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I'm like, well, if you say no to everything, I'm not going to take you seriously, right? There have to be yeses to balance out the no's. And that's where we are in our housing conversation. We as people say no too much, that we've kind of lost the seriousness in the no. You can't really take communities seriously when they say no, because they say no to everything. We have to say yes to stuff as well. Some people really like living in high rises. One of a good friend used to live on one of the southern buildings at Eglinton, and I have a very powerful memory of sitting at those big windows, looking south, watching a thunderstorm over the lake, because the view is just completely unbelievable. And my brother, when he was first married, lived in a building at Yonge and Eglinton, and it was great. We used to take our kids to visit him and walk to the parks nearby. So I respect that. There were things people liked better before. I respect that we need to keep putting trees into it, but I would take really seriously, we have to say yes to enough stuff. We need 300,000 more units in Toronto in a very short period of time. So we need 300,000 yeses before we can start saying no.
As
Very sober note, I want to say thank you to Dr. Saxe and to Richard Gilbert for a fascinating webinar. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And we hope that everyone has enjoyed this webinar series. SCAN, of course, is about action, and the organizers of this series would like to continue working on decarbonizing buildings. If you are interested, please stay on after the session formally ends, and we'll discuss what you would like to do next. Before we end today's session, our organizing groups would like to thank once again Helen Hegedus, who has been handling the tech and much else. We'd also like to thank the speakers today and at our previous session for introducing us to this complex topic so well. And thank all of you for attending. We will now end the recording of this session, and people who wish to stay to chat may do so, and several of the organizing group will be here.
Thank you, Dr. Saxe.
Thank you.
you.